So today I asked you to read, I believe the article is titled Moral Nihilism, Intellectual Nihilism, and Practical Ethics. So we're just going to walk through that today and have a little bit of a discussion on whether or not you agree with this guy's argument, okay, on why we should be rejecting moral nihilism. So the author of this article is Nathan Nobis. He's a philosopher, I believe, at Morehouse College. Yep, a professor of philosophy. And he's somebody who primarily writes on ethics, animal rights, and abortion. So metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics, if you remember all of the distinctions between those views. In this piece specifically, as we'll get into, Nobis is going to argue that we should reject moral nihilism because if we accept it, if we accept the common arguments that are given in favor of moral nihilism, that's going to cause us to reject some things that are fundamental to the way that we think and live our lives. Things that we can't really go without, such as thinking that there are evidence for various viewpoints, thinking that some viewpoints are more reasonable than others, thinking that rationality is a good thing and that we should be rational. As we'll see, Nobis is going to be arguing that if we look at the common arguments for moral nihilism, based on what they're arguing, if they're right, that would cause us to reject all those things I just said. That would cause us to be intellectual nihilists as well. In other words, that would cause us to also accept that there aren't really facts of the matter about what can be known or about what is true and what is false, which is something that we don't want to reject. So, to recap from our first lecture, moral nihilism is the view that there are no moral truths, or another way to put it is there is no fact of the matter about what is right and wrong. This view kind of implies that there is a void or something at the bottom of our moral judgments, our moral statements, and our prescriptions. So the moral nihilist is going to say that when you say something like, hey, lying to your roommate is wrong, you're not really expressing a truth. You're not really expressing a fact. You're just kind of saying something that's nonsensical or doesn't have any correspondence to reality. Okay? Which isn't something that's very intuitive to us, right? Generally, when we make moral claims or prescriptions, we think that we're saying something true, or we're saying something that ought to be, right? Well, moral nihilism denies that. They're going to say, no, there aren't any facts of the matter about what is right and wrong. There are no ultimately moral or immoral actions. It's just a matter of interpretation or conditioning or what have you. Okay? If this view is correct, it has some staggering implications for what we're doing when we judge others, when we say that people should do things and shouldn't do things. If this view is true, we would have to radically alter how we think, speak, and act in our daily lives. For starters, if moral nihilism is true, at the end of the day, nothing is ultimately right or wrong. That would mean murder is not ultimately immoral. Torturing an innocent baby is not ultimately wrong. Telling the truth is not ultimately right. Saving somebody from a burning building, not ultimately right. Okay, not moral or immoral. Likewise, if moral nihilism is true, there isn't much of a basis for critiquing people's actions, right? Y'all judge people all day, every day, right? Maybe it's your roommates, your family members, your friends, yourselves, right? You say to yourself, oh, I should do this and I shouldn't do that. Oh, Greg, you should be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that, right? We make these kinds of claims all the time. But if moral nihilism is true, we wouldn't have any basis for critiquing our own actions or anybody else's actions. Why? Because nothing is ultimately right or wrong at the end of the day. Right? It makes no sense to judge somebody's action and say they should have done something else, morally speaking, if there is no right or wrong. Right? If there's no objective standard of what is right and wrong. And finally, another implication that this view has is if it's true that there are no facts of the matter about what is right and wrong, that means nobody can ever make a moral mistake. Nobody has ever made a moral mistake. And there's no such thing as moral progress. Think about it. Sometimes we feel as if, oh, I did the wrong thing, right? Or, I think Larry did the wrong thing by lying to his girlfriend, right? And I think he made a mistake there. There are no moral mistakes if you accept this view, because there's no objective standard of right and wrong, right? You can't make a mistake because there is nothing ultimately good or bad. Likewise, there is no such thing as moral progress. We kind of presume that throughout the course of our country's history, for example, that we've gotten better, right? That our laws have improved, that we've become more moral people, right? Slavery isn't a thing anymore. We like to think that's a moral improvement. No moral progress on this view. Why? Again, because there's no objective standard of right and wrong. There's no objective standard of right and wrong. There's no way to track whether or not we're getting better or worse at things. Does that make sense? So these are some of the implications of the moral nihilist position. Do y'all remember the app Whisper? Or are you too young for that? There was this app that came out years ago. It was like, oh, you could post anonymous messages for people to read in your local area, right? Okay, well, this is an image I found. It was from Whisper, like on Google. The moral nihilist position is basically this. There's nothing called right or wrong, really. It's just perspective and judgment at the end of the day, man. That's basically what the moral nihilistic position is. There might be some reasons to be drawn to this position, right? It would certainly make our lives easier. It would make our own lack of development and progress in our own lives not feel so bad. It might help us sleep better at night. But as we're going to see, at least according to Nobis, there are some serious problems with this position. He's going to be arguing that the common arguments for moral nihilism are going to imply a bunch of things that are just terrible and bad and that don't really make any sense, so we should reject it. And we're going to see throughout the course of this lecture if you agree with that. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay. Now I'm going to kind of summarize some of the arguments that Nobis discusses in the article. One argument he talks about for moral nihilism is from a philosophy known as logical positivism. Logical positivism was this philosophy that arose during the middle of the 20th century. Very scientifically minded folks who basically thought, we're only going to accept as true whatever can be empirically verified through science and experimentation and mathematics and logic. Anything else, we're going to be skeptical about whether or not those things are true. Okay? So if it can be proved by science, experimentation, observation, we're going to say it's true. Well, one of the things that the logical positivists began critiquing eventually was this idea that there is an objective standard of right and wrong, that there are moral facts. Why? Can you see moral facts with a microscope? Can you measure the morality of an action with a spectrometer? No, it doesn't seem to be something that's in the world like an atom is, or a table, or a wave function. Right? It's something weird. So if it can't be measured, if it can't be verified using experimental means, they're going to reject it, which is what they did. This is a picture of A.J. Ayer, who is one of the famous logical positivists to come out of this movement. Their basic position was that only things that are empirically verifiable are true or false. Only things that can be verified true or false through the scientific method, through experimentation, through logic and mathematics, that kind of stuff. But there are several problems with logical positivism. We're going to focus just on the claims it makes about morality, because this is an introduction to ethics class. One thing that Nobis brings up is he looks at the logical positivist position in this article, and he says, but look, there are lots of judgments and statements that cannot be empirically verified, that you can't test, that you can't measure with a scientific apparatus, okay, with a microscope or whatever. For example, moral statements, right, like we said, you can't see a moral fact with a microscope or determine whether an action was right or wrong by running like a scientific experiment, right? Can't do that. But likewise, there are other things that we can't empirically verify. For example, judgments about what is reasonable. Let me ask you this. If I said, I'm wearing a red shirt, is that a reasonable position? Am I being reasonable in saying that? What do you think? Most of you are like, yeah, it's a reasonable position, right? I can clearly see you're wearing a red shirt, right? Science can't tell us whether or not what I just said is reasonable. Reasonability is not something that can be measured, right? Reasonability is not something that can be experimented upon or divined through the scientific method, right? Likewise, for the positions that should be believed based on the evidence or should be rejected based on the data, that isn't stuff that we can figure out through scientific experimentation. Let's say I give you a whole bunch of data for a position and a whole bunch of data against a position. You've got to sort through all that data to figure out what it is that you should believe. And I tell you, well, based on the data, you should believe this position. Whether or not you should believe it is not something that we can see, right, or hear, or experiment upon, or look at through an electron microscope. Are lots of judgments and statements that we make are things that cannot be empirically verified. So this argument doesn't seem to be a good one, because we'd have to toss out a whole bunch of other stuff too. Stuff that we think makes sense and that we rely on in daily life. Like the idea that there's evidence for a position, or a certain position is more reasonable than another one. And what's very interesting about this idea, this position that only things that are empirically verifiable are true or false, that position itself cannot be empirically verified. Right? This is the starting point of logical positivism. But how can that claim be verified through the scientific method? It can't. Right? It's just like an axiom. It's like the foundational belief of this philosophical movement. Okay? It's not something that can be experimented upon or scientifically deduced with our observations and predictions and hypotheses. The idea that only things that are empirically verifiable are true or false is itself not empirically verifiable. You see what I mean when I say that? Can somebody explain it back to me in their own words, if you feel like you understand it?
The whole basis of logical positivism is that we have to check to make sure, through science, that these things are true. But how do you check that this theory is true through science? You can't.
Right, exactly. It's like this statement is something that you have to accept before you start doing the science. But the statement itself is not something that you can use science to figure out, right? It's just like, this is our position. Yeah. So in a weird way, the main claim that logical positivism is based on is undercut by its own idea. It's undermined. So, Nobis says, at least this argument that because moral facts cannot be empirically verified, we should throw them out, this is a bad argument. We shouldn't accept this argument. It's not a good one. So he says logical positivism does not really have a good case on its own merits for why there aren't moral truths. Make sense? I know this conversation is pretty meta, but we'll get more into the nitty-gritty and practical stuff as we go through the semester. First, we just have to get this kind of boring stuff out of the way. I'm sorry. But there are other arguments that have been put forth against the idea that there's an objective standard of right and wrong, that there are moral facts about what is moral and immoral. One comes from emotivism, which is a view that we looked at in the last lecture. If anybody has not looked at the screen yet, can you remember what emotivism is? Yeah.
Isn't it nothing's really right or wrong, it's just kind of based on your emotions and feelings?
Yeah. It's basically when we're making moral statements, when we're saying things like murder is wrong, it's not based on a belief we have. It's just an expression of how we're feeling. Yeah, that's what emotivism says. And so what they're going to say when it comes to moral facts, moral statements, is, moral judgments are just expressions of emotions. They're not true or false because they're not descriptions of the world. They're not claims about the way the universe is. They're just expressions of our emotions, like, is an expression of an emotion when you stub your toe. It's not true or false, right? Well, Nobis has some things to say about this argument too, from the emotivists. First off, it certainly seems that our moral statements are expressions of beliefs that we have, right? Can anybody think of a moral statement that they've made in the last week? Did you tell someone that they should or shouldn't do something? Did you tell your roommate, hey, you shouldn't eat my cake in the fridge, or something like that? Somebody give me an example. Yeah.
I tried expressing, not changing someone's belief, but challenging them to believe that capital punishment is not the right way.
Okay, so what did you said capital punishment is immoral?
I use the argument that if we use the punishments that the crime was committed to, if we did that, that would be immoral. Because the only crime that we commit to the person that they committed is murder on murder. So if we did that with every other crime, it would be immoral, but it's not to take a life.
Okay. And do you believe that?
I don't think it's fair to say that we could take a life, but we can't. If you were to say that every crime that's committed, you have to commit that crime to that person. So if someone assaults someone, you have to assault them. That's immoral, but taking a life is not.
Let me put it a different way. When you were talking to this person, did you think you were just expressing your emotions? Or did you think you were trying to express something the way the universe is?
More that way. Yeah.
What do you think you're doing when you're telling your roommate or your family member or your sibling they should or shouldn't do something?
I think you're objectively correct.
You think you're right? And you're trying to tell them the way it is. Hey, you shouldn't murder that baby for fun. That's not cool. I take it all of you believe that, right? If you were ever to say that, it wouldn't just be an expression of your emotion at the time, right? It'd be based on a position that you hold, right? You fundamentally think murdering innocent babies for fun is wrong, right? So it certainly seems like our moral judgments and statements are based on belief, that they're trying to talk about the way the world is, that they're expressing a fact of the matter, right? Another argument that emotivists make, though, emotivists, is that when we're making a moral statement, it is an expression of emotion, but at the same time, moral statements, insofar as they motivate people, aren't actual statements, because the only things that can move us to do one thing or another is an emotion. So think about it like this. This is basically what the emotivists are saying. What pushes or pulls us to do something is feeling a certain way. When somebody says something to you that you should or shouldn't do something, if that pushes or pulls you a certain way, that's evidence that what you did was express an emotion, because things that are not emotions can't push or pull you a certain way. Does that make sense? How Nobis cashes this out is he says, the emotivists say that moral expressions are motivational. Only emotions are motivational. They push and pull people in certain directions. So, if an expression is motivational, then it's not true or false. Because in essence, it is emotional in its character. It's like a force.
So does Nihilism have like that part where it's saying yes, it's an emotion, but it's also a belief, or that's not like that doesn't have it?
No, the emotivists are going to say that when we say things about morality, we're just expressing an emotion.
So not beliefs.
Not beliefs.
Okay.
Yeah. And part of the evidence that they use for that is this idea that if I were to say something to you and that were to push and pull you in a certain way, it's motivational. That's what that means. It would mean that I'm not expressing just a belief, because a belief isn't going to push or pull you in a certain way. I'm expressing something that is essentially emotional, because emotions is what motivate us and push and pull us around.
So is that saying that we don't have beliefs, or that beliefs are like built on emotions?
They would more so say the second one.
Okay.
But what you've just asked is a good question, because it raises a serious point that Nobis brings up. It would seem that just because something does push or pull us in a certain way doesn't mean it's not a belief. Right? Just because something is motivational, that it pushes or pulls you in a certain way, doesn't mean it can't be something else too. Like a belief, or like a rational prescription or something like that. If I laid out a logical case for you for why you should get up at 6:30 in the morning and do this certain routine, and I gave you all this evidence or data, and you're thinking to yourself, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm rationally convinced by that, I should do that, and your position changed based on the evidence I gave you. I didn't get in touch with your emotions, right? I got in touch with your logical faculties that caused you to change your position. So there we have evidence of something that is motivational. It's caused you to change your position, but it's not emotional. Right? So what Nobis is going to say is one of the problems with the emotivist position is that they cash things out that are motivational as just being emotional at the end of the day. But that's not necessarily true. People are pushed and pulled in different ways by a variety of forces. Emotions, beliefs, what is rational, what is spiritual, maybe. Maybe that has something to do with emotions, but... So this argument that moral judgments are just expressions of emotions because they push and pull people in different ways is not a good argument. Because there are lots of things that push and pull people in different ways that are not emotional, such as reason, such as our beliefs. Finally, one other thing that he talks about with regards to emotivism is this idea that moral facts are strange. Think about it. I'm wearing a red shirt is a position that we can all take, right, and believe in. What would make that position true?
The fact that you're wearing a red shirt.
The fact that I'm wearing a red shirt, right, exactly. The fact that this shirt is actually red. What would make a moral statement true or false? It's a weird question, right? And it's a weird question, and it's kind of hard to grasp and get our minds around. The emotivists are going to say, look, because we can't answer that question really well, and it's weird, kind of tells us that maybe there aren't moral facts at all. Maybe it's just a fiction that we've made up, or, look, we can't locate them in the world, so what are moral facts, and what are they based on? So they'll say, moral facts are really strange. It's not clear how we could know them, so it's likely that they don't exist. Well, Nobis says, the strangeness of moral facts is not a good enough reason to reject them. Intellectual judgments are also strange. For example, if I said, I'm wearing a silver watch, is that a reasonable position?
Sure. Yes.
What makes it a reasonable position? Intellectual judgments are going to be akin to judgments that we make about matters of morality too. When it comes to reasonability or evidence or what we should rationally believe in, those facts are strange too, right? And they can't be located in the world, right? You can't look under a microscope to see what positions are reasonable and what you should believe in, right? You actually have to think through stuff and reflect and look at all these different perspectives. Nobis's basic point here is, look, just because moral facts seem strange is not a good enough reason to reject them. There are a whole bunch of things that we rely on and accept in our everyday lives that are strange, okay? Like our intellectual judgments about what is reasonable, about what counts as evidence for a view and what doesn't, about whether or not we're behaving in a rational or an irrational way. So he's going to say this idea that moral facts don't exist because they're strange and they seem to be expressions of just emotions, this is not a good argument, okay? And like the previous argument from logical positivism, if we accept it, it would cause us to reject all these other things that don't make sense to reject, like the reasonability of our judgments, or the reasonability of what counts as evidence for something and what doesn't. Here's what Nobis has to say about this in his own words. Stevenson, this is another philosopher he's citing, said that he just can't picture what a moral fact would be like. What would make a moral judgment true? But anyone puzzled about this should also be puzzled about what would make our intellectual or epistemological judgments true. Epistemological here means knowledge-based. It's not clear at all what in the world makes it true that something is evidence for some belief, or that some evidence is sufficient evidence, and that some beliefs are rational, justified, known, ought to be held or rejected, and so on. This ontological obscurity is common to both moral statements and all these other judgments and statements we make about legal proceedings, reasonability, justifiability, rationality, and so on. The theme emerging here is this. When moral nihilists argue for their position, they do this by claiming that moral judgments have various features. And since they have these features, they are never true. Some of these claims about what moral judgments are like are quite plausible, that they are not empirically confirmable, for example. But other times they are doubtful, for example, that moral judgments are necessarily motivational. But any of these claims can be part of a sound argument for moral nihilism only if the premise validly linking them to the conclusion is true, that any judgment having these features is never true, either because such judgments are neither true nor false, or because there is nothing to make them true. So do you understand what he's saying? The basic argument that is being offered for the moral nihilist position says that moral facts don't exist because they have certain features, if any statements have these certain features, they're never true. Well, the problem with that general argument is that there are a lot of statements besides moral facts that have these features. Things that we can't do without. Things that it doesn't make sense to reject. So these arguments are not good for moral nihilism. Finally, here's how he concludes. This premise, as we have seen, has radical implications for judgments beyond morality, most notably intellectual and epistemic judgments that are essential to reasoning and science. It suggests that no judgments like these are ever true. This is a radically irrationalist consequence. If we have reason to think that we sometimes can reason, think through things, and that judgments describing how we ought to reason and what we ought to believe are justified, are rational, and so on, and are sometimes true, then we have reason to reject these arguments for moral nihilism. That is, if we accept that there are facts of the matter about when a position is justified, when we are being reasonable or irreasonable, when we are being rational or irrational, if there are facts of the matter about these things, then that shows that this argument that they're putting forth against moral facts is a bad one. Because these judgments have those same features they were critiquing about moral facts. Does that make sense? It's a weird argument. I know it's a weird position. It's meta, okay? But I think if you reread the article, if you go back and listen to this lecture again, it'll sink in a little bit more. It's a weird argument, but I think it makes sense. Okay. So, to summarize, this is what he's saying. These arguments against moral realism that he has been looking at in this article would undermine a bunch of other things that we rely on in human life. Facts about what is evidence for something, facts about what is reasonable or unreasonable to believe, facts about what is rational to think or do, etc. Do you all think there are facts of the matter about these things? Is there a fact of the matter about what makes a position reasonable or unreasonable? I think most people think so, right? Are there facts of the matter about what we should believe and shouldn't believe based on the evidence? I think we act that way, don't we? When we critique others' positions, when we put forth evidence for our own views. Are there facts of the matter about what is rational to believe and what is irrational to believe? I think so. I think we kind of presume that. If there are facts of the matter about those things, Nobis is saying this argument for moral nihilism is bad because it implies that there aren't facts of the matter about those things. And it seems like there are.
So, if moral nihilists believe that nothing is true or false, how can they believe that their statement is true or false?
That's one of the deep problems. This is a position known as epistemic nihilism. Epistemic nihilism is going to say either we can't know what's true or false, or there are no facts of the matter about what's true or false. And if you fervently believe that position, you would also have to believe there are no reasons to believe that position. Right? So it would undermine itself. That's kind of what's being implied by what Nobis is saying here. Yeah. The very arguments that they're putting forth undermine their own position. So it's an unreasonable position to accept. Yeah. Okay. I knew I threw a lot of information at you. I'm going to let the gears turn a little bit. Again, I would encourage you to read this article again to help it sink in. The majority of the articles after this are not going to be this meta or this confusing. This is just one that I think is good to evince why moral nihilism is not a position that is taken very seriously in academics. And it doesn't seem to be a position that people really believe insofar as they judge others as they judge our society, as they say things should be certain ways. Okay. To cash this out a little bit more, I'll give you some implications of what would happen if we were to accept these arguments, these moral nihilistic arguments. If we accept that all statements that have those general features we were talking about are true, that would lead us to the idea that there are no facts about what is evidence for something. What would this lead us to? This would lead us necessarily to the position that we could have no legal cases or proceedings or more or less reasonable views. If there isn't a fact of the matter about what is evidence for something and what isn't, then there would be no law, right? There would be no guilt or punishment or execution of the law. So, if the arguments in this paper are true that he is critiquing, we'd have to throw out our whole legal system. Because after all, there is no evidence, there's no fact of the matter about what is evidence for something or what is not. Likewise, if there are no facts about what is reasonable or unreasonable, that would imply there's no basis for judging others' beliefs or judging any views based on their reasonability. Is anybody here? No, I won't ask that. Let me just put forth an example for you. There are a lot of people on YouTube that are internet atheists that make a living off of critiquing people's arguments for the existence of God, right? And saying, oh, these people are stupid, they're dumb, look at all this science and evidence. People wouldn't be able to judge others' beliefs or undermine their beliefs at all or say that they're being stupid if there are no facts about what is reasonable or unreasonable to believe. The internet atheists think that Christians, for example, are being unreasonable given the evidence. But by making their judgments and giving their arguments and critiquing Christians and Hindus and Buddhists and all these people, they're presuming there are facts of the matter about which positions are reasonable and unreasonable to hold. If there are no such facts, we have no basis for judging others' beliefs. We have no basis for critiquing others' beliefs. We have no basis saying, you shouldn't believe that, you should believe this other thing instead. But we do this all the time, right? We kind of presume that, yeah, there's a basis for judging people's beliefs. If I believed that the moon was square and it was made of cheese, and if I went around it 10 times, I'd turn into a wizard, is that a reasonable view? You'd say, Professor Gunner, what the fuck are you talking about? Right? You'd say, that's stupid, that's unreasonable. What evidence do you have for that? If you're thinking that way, that shows you believe that there are facts about what is reasonable and unreasonable. Finally, if there are no facts about what is rational to think or do, there's no basis for claiming that someone is irrational or that others should be rational. Right? I bet a lot of you get so frustrated when you watch your friends and family members do things because you're like, that's stupid, you're not thinking. You know? Look at what he's doing to you. He's cheated on you 3 times and you're going to accept him back again. You know he's going to cheat. This is the irrational thing to do, Jenna. If you ever have these feelings or these thoughts, you think there are facts of the matter about what it is rational to think and or do. And you're upset at your friends because they're not thinking rationally, they're not behaving rationally, right? The problem with the argument that is put forth by the moral nihilists is that if we take it to its logical conclusion, it would seem to imply these bad things. Things that we don't accept. So either moral nihilism as a position is wrong, or the argument that they're putting forth is not a good one. It's a bad one. In other words, to help put it into perspective, accepting the common moral nihilistic arguments against moral facts would require us to reject things that we think and accept and do in daily life, like washing the dishes.
I'd rather not wash the dishes.
I'd rather not wash the dishes too, but it's something that we do and that we got to do, right? Likewise, it seems like judging other people's beliefs, thinking some positions are reasonable or rational, is something that we just do and we can't get away from, right? We just accept it. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? All right. So I just want to add a few things, and then I'll end by posing some questions to you, and maybe we can have a little discussion about some of the main ideas here. To summarize, if you believe in this argument that the moral nihilists are putting forth, that would also imply no one could critique another's thoughts, words, or actions on moral grounds. No one could have a basis for saying one policy or culture is better than any other, nor could one claim that there has been any moral progress. But it seems like we do this stuff. And it seems like we want to do this stuff, and we kind of can't get away from doing this stuff. So maybe that might lead us to believe that moral nihilism is not a tenable position. Based on the argument that you asked, Brian, if you dig deeper into the philosophy here, get a little bit more into the weeds, it would seem like the main arguments for moral nihilism also seem to undermine the possibility for knowledge at all. Because if there aren't facts about what is reasonable or unreasonable, what is rational or irrational, if we can't know what the facts are about a wide range of things, how can we know whether or not something is true or false? How can we know whether or not we have the right position? How could we know whether or not the data supports a position, or a certain position is reasonable or unreasonable, or rational or irrational? This isn't super important, but if you want, you can look up epistemic nihilism on your own time. It's basically the position that we either can't know how the universe works, we don't have access to the facts, or there isn't like an objective way that things are. And if you accept either of those positions, that would seem to undermine the nihilist position itself. Because if you can't know what the facts are, if you don't know the way the universe works, how can you know that there are no facts? How can you know that there isn't anything to know? If that makes sense. It's a weird idea, but this is kind of what philosophers do. They kind of think themselves into these weird positions. Okay? Yeah. Epistemic nihilism. Here, I'll write it out for you. It is a view in epistemology, which in philosophy is the study of knowledge. What do we know? How do we know it? What are the conditions for knowledge? How do we know when our knowledge has been undermined? We're not going to be studying that in this class so much. We look at that a little bit in my introduction to philosophy classes. But this is a position that some people hold that I think is crazy. But it's not for me to decide what you believe. You got to do that for yourself. Thus, at least according to the argument that the moral nihilists seem to put forth, based on that argument alone, it would seem like this position that moral facts don't exist should be rejected. But again, this is just based on the one argument that we've been looking at in this lecture specifically. There are lots of other arguments for moral nihilism. A lot of ones that are pretty intuitive that you might find convincing. So don't take my word as gospel, okay? This is a rare time where I'm actually going to tell you what I believe, but just because I believe this doesn't mean that you should, okay? Really dig into this. Think for yourself. Talk about this stuff with your friends and family members, okay? Don't just accept it because this is what I think, okay? All right. Any questions? Y'all are probably like, I didn't follow this at all. I'm not going to say anything. That's okay. It'll get easier. The future readings are going to be easier to understand. Except for the Kant reading. I'm sorry, that one's going to suck. Let me just put forth a question to you. Perhaps a few questions. If moral nihilism is an untenable position, if we agree with Nobis that their argument is bad, doesn't seem like this is a good take, what should we believe in instead? Or maybe I could ask, what do you believe in? Do you believe that there's an objective standard of right and wrong? Or do you believe that morality is relative to the culture or society in which you live? What do you think? Yes?
I think that it's relative to what your culture is, because each culture, each religion has a different set of morality rules. Like in Catholicism, they have a strict set of morality rules, like abortion's bad, contraception is bad, but anything else is good, pretty much. So I feel like it always depends on what you follow, what your culture is.
Okay, so you're more of a moral relativist? You think what's good or bad is kind of dependent on society or culture?
Good or bad wouldn't exist if we didn't come up with it as a social construct.
Okay.
That's what I believe.
Yeah, that's a position that a lot of people take. Yeah.
I'd argue more moral realist, but like as a thing that you discover, like you are constantly discovering like the rules and we don't know them yet. Because
okay.
Because moral relativism, like they thought that it was like you used to go to the town square to watch someone be hung, and that was fine. But that's like if we said we were going to do public hangings now, everyone would go, that's not morally correct. But people used to find joy in watching it.
Okay.
I don't like that it kind of depends here or there.
So you think there's an objective standard of what is right and wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and over time we tend to figure out what that is,
Yeah.
and we've gotten better
Yeah.
at knowing what that is over time.
Yeah.
Like maybe in the past, we thought, yeah, slavery's cool, woo, but now we're like, ooh,
Yeah.
like not good. Okay. What do the rest of y'all think? Do you believe in one of these two positions? Do you have a different one? A little bit of both. Will you say more about that?
There are objective things that are wrong. Pedophilia is wrong. That is an objective stance. It is the truth. The relative part is other stances. If I think I'm allowed to carry a gun, some people don't. That's more of the relative side. If you were to come up and try and stab me right now, to what extent am I allowed to defend myself? Did you mean to kill me, or did you just mean to injure me? If I throw you out that window, is that the objective thing, right or wrong? And that's been relative throughout history.
Okay, so there's some things you think that are objectively good and objectively bad. And then there's kind of a gray area with other things. Okay. Yes?
See, I kind of agree with that. Like, there is a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah, things are objectively bad, like pedophilia and things like that. Or slavery is bad, lynching, the KKK, all that stuff is bad. So maybe not fully on what you believe, but if your culture is special to you or your religion is special to you, I say follow it, do what you want to do, just don't be an asshole.
Okay. Yeah, I like the don't be an asshole bit. That's nice. I mean, I don't disagree with what you said. Yeah, it certainly seems if, for the majority of people, there are things that they think are just objectively bad and objectively good, no matter the circumstance. But not everybody believes that, right? So we're going to look at a lot of moral theories throughout this class of what makes an action moral or immoral. I want you to wrestle with these a lot because they are going to test your convictions. Some of the ideas you might think are out there, but I have no doubt that you will all learn and grow a lot if you actually think about this stuff and talk about it with your friends and family members. Yeah. I'll give you last word on this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not really too sure where I stand, but I think when it comes to there being gray areas between the two, I think as an individual you kind of have to make up our mind, or else it's really hard to judge what's actually right or wrong.
Yeah. Maybe that's something you get better at as you live your life and have experiences, and maybe study this stuff too. Maybe this will all help you along your own moral development. I don't know. Okay, how about this? What do you think makes an action moral or immoral at the end of the day? Have any of you thought hard about this? For example, I'm at the store, and it's a small store, mom and pop shop, locally owned, really nice, quaint. I'm walking down the aisle, and I'm looking for a gift for my girlfriend, okay? But I get a little clumsy, and I accidentally knock something off of the shelf, and it shatters and breaks. I didn't try to do that. I didn't intend to do that. But I caused the business harm, right? I caused them money. Did I do something bad? I accidentally did something bad. Okay. What makes it bad? Or what would make it not bad? Did I not do a bad thing after all?
What makes it bad is that, like you said, you wrecked the business, but if you confess to it or if you pay the fine of whatever the thing is, you made it better.
Okay, so I can make up for it by doing something else, but I still did something bad.
Yes.
We might say immoral here. Did I do something immoral?
Is it objectively immoral, or is it decided after the fact if it's immoral?
Right, that's a good question. In the back. My intention wasn't bad, right? But what were you going to say? Her. I can't see your name tag, I'm sorry. Mia, okay.
Yeah, I think it depends on your reaction afterwards. If you just run away, or if you try to help or pay for it, just depends on what you do afterwards.
Oh, so my reaction to it determines whether I did something immoral or immoral.
I would agree with that.
So, if I'm walking down the street and I accidentally bump into an old lady and she falls on the ground and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, and I pick her up and I help her out, I didn't do a bad thing.
Well, how you feel. You're clean at that point, I think.
I'm clean. Is that different?
I think you got it back.
It's all in how you react to it.
Really got the rebound.
If you react to it wrong, it's probably wrong. If you react to it right, it's probably right.
Okay.
Well, what if you've already had that preconceived notion, like I'm going to knock this old lady over, and you react like you did something, like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
Right, yeah.
Or a car crash.
Yeah, what if I intended to knock an old lady down, and then just for everybody around me's sake, I pretended that I didn't try to do that, and I was like, oh, I'll help you up, I'm so sorry. Then did I do a bad thing? Maybe, yeah. There are several different views. We're going to go through a bunch. What I'm trying to tease out for you is how a bunch of these philosophers throughout history have wrestled with these questions. So we're going to look at a view that says if your intention is bad, then you did an immoral thing. We're going to look at a view that says it doesn't matter what your intentions are or your desires, your beliefs. It's whether or not you made the world a better place or made it a worse place. So in the shop example, that view would say, I did a bad thing because I harmed them by breaking their merchandise, regardless of what I wanted to do or not. I made the situation worse off. There's another view that says, well, what you should be doing at the end of the day is what makes you the best version of yourself that you can be. That's what makes an action moral or immoral. There's another view that says we get morality from God. There's another view that says what's moral is just what's good for you. Fuck everybody else. So if you're furthering your own goals, if you're increasing your own power and control, you're doing a good thing. But nobody else should really matter. And then there's a view that says, well, really the morality of an action is based on whether or not you're showing up in your relationships properly and caring for people. Care is important in that view. Think through some of those different ideas as we move forward through this unit. Because later we're going to be looking at these different ethical theories, arguments for and against them. And then we'll be applying them to ethical conundrums, like abortion, euthanasia, sweatshops, incest, whatever it is that y'all voted on. And so I'd like to leave you with this. Whatever you do believe in, try to figure out where you got those beliefs from. Did you get them from a religion? Did you get them from your parents or how you were raised? Did you get them from society? Did you actually come to your ethical beliefs after thinking through these things on your own? I'm betting the majority of people haven't, me included. Right? Probably a lot of what we believe is not stuff that we came to on our own. So try to figure that out. Try to figure out what your beliefs are, some of them, and where you think they came from. This will set us up for our next lecture, in which we look at the moral relativistic position, which argues that morality is not, there's no objective standard that holds for all people. It's just relative to the culture or society in which you're in. Okay, so do that reading for Thursday, and I guess I'll see you then. That's all I have for you. Any questions, concerns, or comments? Yes. Here, one second. Let me turn this off.